Thank you for joining us today. Me and myself, Adrian, are going to introduce ourselves first of all. So those of you who don't know me, I'm Phee. So I work for the Chiltern Learning Trust and I'm based between Chantry and Whitefield, and though I come and say hello to Adrian at Southfield sometimes. I also am a core MaST tutor for the Shire Foundation and a primary MaST specialist for the Enigma MaST Hub. So MaST is kind of at the core of everything that I do. And my partner in crime
is Adrian. I am a acting deputy head at Southfield Primary at the moment. So I also work within the Pioneer Learning Trust, and I am also the maths coordinator here, and I have the MaST training to go with that as well.
Lovely. Okay, so without further ado, we will get started. Both Adrian and I, if you've ever had any training with us before, we quite like to share examples and talk rather than kind of doing lots of things with PowerPoint. So we have got some slides to share with you and hopefully some websites for you to have a look at to support the progress in your children going forward. Right, so without further ado, let's get this show on the road. So I'm hoping that you all come to the right session and that we're here to look at progress in maths for all of our learners today. So here we go. First thing to do is we're going to talk about what is progress.
Okay, so we thought we'd put the dictionary definitions of what progress is up first. So we've got to be forward or onward movement towards a destination, or move forward or onwards in space or time. But when it comes to progress in maths, what does that actually mean? Well, it means things like the children have got to be able to build on their current knowledge to move forward. They've got to be able to understand what they're learning. They've got to be able to apply that understanding to whatever concept it is that they're learning. But the important thing that we wanted to highlight is that all children progress at different paces. There are lots of people that think that it's going to be like a really linear line of progression, but that's not the case. You might have children that make really good fast progress early on and then slow down a little bit before making better progress again. Other people could be just constantly up and down. Okay, it's because children are all different. So progress is about building on the foundations that they've already got and increasing the depth of their understanding.
And how do we do that? Well, you'll all be really familiar with this. So National Curriculum 2013. I remember when this kind of first came out and we were talking about it in lots of training sessions. It was, oh my goodness, this is going to be awful. How possibly we're going to be able to do this with all of our children? But when you look at it and you unpick some of those key ideas, what do we want our children to do? We want them to be fluent. And you'll hear that a lot in any other training that you do, in textbooks, in lots of the research materials. So we want to be fluent, we're going to be able to play with numbers, all that arithmetic style, the recall of knowledge. Because remember, if children can have that quick recall of knowledge, it allows their brains to kind of have the capacity to work on those more challenging problems. So helping our children to make sure they know their number 1 to 10 off by heart, to 20 for their times tables, which is why they do that times table test. We want them to reason mathematically using lots of that vocabulary. They were to unpick some of those key terms. I don't know how many of you have looked at a problem and it says spent and they're not quite sure what that means in the context of the maths, what they need to be doing. So we need to be saying, are they right? How do you know? Tell me more. And we want that to come from the children as opposed to the teacher-led part of the lesson. And as the National Curriculum says, we want them to be able to solve problems. We want them to find not just one solution, but a variety of solutions, and then find the best way forward. And the big thing I want to kind of just going to go over again what Adrian said is that this is about children broadly learning at the same pace, okay, broadly, which means for most of your children, you're going to take them through this journey together, but you are going to have some children, and you know them already, who are working significantly below, and what they do in that classroom is going to look slightly different. And the same again with those children who are working at a standard of greater depth. They're going to work through the tasks with their peers, but they're going to need something extra, something to deepen that understanding, because they've got that fluency with the numbers that they're working with. So just something to consider when you're looking at the national curriculum and what does it look like in your classroom, particularly in a Teaching for Mastery classroom, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about that going forward. So during our session today,
okay, so the things that we're going to be looking at that will help make all children in your classes make progress is we're going to be looking at Teaching for Mastery. So we're going to be talking about what that actually looks like, what that involves. We'll be looking at where gaps in learning might have occurred and why they might have occurred. We'll have a look at the prioritisation document to help you decide which elements of the teaching are the most important. We'll be looking at a school example, how we can learn from others, and we'll also be looking at misconceptions and deepening of understanding as well.
And we're going to do that in the next 51 minutes, so don't be worried that we're going to spend hours and hours, although those of you that know me, I could spend a long time talking about all of those things. And so the big thing I want to start with is Teaching for Mastery, but Teaching for Mastery is kind of underpinned by these 5 big ideas. So whether your school uses White Rose, whether they use deepening understanding, whether they use a mixture of lots of different things, whether they use Power Maths, etc., they will all be underpinned by these 5 key ideas. So these 5 big ideas. So we've got representation and structure. What do things look like? So what underpins the maths? So for example, you're looking at addition within 10. What does that look like on a tens frame? What does that look like with Numicon? How are those links there? What does that look like with the Unifix cubes? So they're showing it in a variety of different ways. 1 + 2 = 3. It doesn't matter which way round that you do it, that is the case, and it's the kind of the building blocks of it. Obviously, there's much more than that, but this is a very kind of a snapshot for you. Mathematical thinking, as you will know, Katie, well, it's all about that questioning. Tell me more. How do you know? I know this because I know this, therefore I know that. And helping children to make those connections between their learning, those probing questions. Historically, and I did it myself as a teacher, you just take that first answer. But actually with this, it's about, okay, what do you think? What do you think? Do you agree with him? So that the children are kind of sort of building up that confidence with the concept. You've then got variation. And I'm going to explain a little tiny bit more about this because this is the most difficult one with Teaching for Mastery. And it is the procedural and there's a conceptual variation. Conceptual very much about what things look like. And if you think about it in the context of shape, triangles, what makes a triangle? How do you know it's a triangle? And more importantly, looking at the different types of triangles and the not examples. And that's where it comes into its own. The not examples are what your children will pick up on the most, I think. So if you've got children who are struggling with concepts, so say, for example, you're adding and you're regrouping those ones in the tens column. And if you show them ones where it hasn't been done correctly, they're more than likely to be able to pick up on how to do that right later on. So if you draw your attention to those not examples. Same again with the procedural variation, and I'll show you it's very much to do with the kind of the numbers, what stays the same and what changes. And we've already mentioned there about the fluency, the bread and butter, the facts, the things that those children just must know. You'll all know your children in upper key stage 2, year 5s, year 6s, or even year 7s, who are still counting on their fingers, 21, 22, 23, etc. And we want to kind of help children to stop that. So this here comes from the NCTM and the Teaching for Mastery and what underpins it. So when you look at those White Rose materials, you can see where it's all coming from going forward. And as I promised, here is an example of the conceptual and the procedural variation. So if you're looking there, just different ways. If you can look at the conceptual one, I've got my arrays there, I've got my groups of, I've got my more formal kind of written methods. So it's kind of looking at the different examples, looking at it in the concept of an area model, which is quite nice for children. They don't often see the link between the times tables and the area. So that's just a kind of very brief overview of conceptual variation. And if you look at the one for the procedural variation, this is one of my favourite examples. If you look at the top example here, look at what stays the same between each of those. So what is that top example asking you to do? Well, if you look carefully, it's got the dots here, and there's no numbers at this point, and it hasn't been unitized. So I've got 4 and I've got 3. Well, if I add them together, that's going to give me 7. So same again, I can look at this one and I can add my 5 and 3 and I'll be able to put 8 in there. So it's a quite nice visual example. It's got 1 filled in for you here, and these ones it hasn't. So the child would have to fill that in. It then moves down to the next level where it's now been unitized. So instead of 9 dots, I've got the number 9 and then I've got the number 2. And I know from the previous example that I'm going to have to add them both together. So I'm kind of moving that knowledge on now. And if you look at this one, well, I know that 5 adds 7. Okay, I'm going to make that to 12. I know the total. And again, if you consider, hopefully, Katie, you'll have seen the kind of part-whole models, that cherry model that you'll have seen within the classes. Same idea. I know the whole. I know one part, but I don't know the other part. And if I find out what that part is, so 13 subtract 7, it will give you that answer and so on. So you can then build in kind of the gaps. And then looking at the last example, well, this time, again, it's taking it a step further. I know what the totals could be, but I don't know at this point what the parts are. And I'm going to have to use my knowledge. For example, if I'm looking at the one that makes 3, I know that those 2 numbers can't be greater than 3. But at the same time, I know that they've got to make sure that they don't, I've got to make sure that when I add them, that I can make the 4 in the next pile. So a lot of a deeper thinking, but it's the same concept. So just those slight tweaks and changes. And when we're working on progress with our children, sometimes they're only going to work on that first example because we're going to draw their attention to it. What do you notice? And we don't want children just to have that complete closed procedure, 4 plus 3 equals 4 plus 4 equals 4 plus 5. We want them to start thinking, but in a safe space. So noticing, what do you notice? What's the same? They might then move on to the second one. What's the same about both examples? Well, that's numbers and that's now spots. Okay, so let's build on that. So that will help develop that independence, because sometimes, and particularly with everything that's happened over the last couple of years, their confidence has been knocked quite a lot. So supporting them with their scaffolding questions will allow them to kind of build already. Okay, that's enough about variation for now.
Okay, so one of the key things that we need to think about when we're thinking about progress is what gaps in learning the children might have and why they might have occurred. So obviously, we are still at the, hopefully the tail end of a pandemic. And that has meant that there's lots of gaps in children's learning. The good news is, though, it's quite easy to identify those gaps. So if you have when you come to teach something, say, for example, you're in year 5 and you're going to be teaching fractions, you can have a look at what they should have been taught in year 4 as your starting point. You could have add in an extra lesson, have a look at what they can and can't do, and then plan and adapt your lessons accordingly. We're finding that there are actually quite a lot of gaps that the pandemic have caused in lots of different places that you wouldn't expect, and that's mostly because maths lessons link on one from another to another to another. So if you miss a small amount, you end up having that hole form in your learning. Obviously, very similar to the pandemic, general attendance. You can have children that with poor attendance, and if you have a look at their rate of progress, you're almost certainly going to see that their rate of progress is less than children who have very good attendance. The question is, though, what can you actually do about it? It's not too bad if you've got a child that misses just one day. You can go back over what they missed the day before. During the lesson, you could plan in some interventions or some pre-teaching, and you could very quickly close that gap. But if you've got someone that is regularly off 2 or 3 days every single week, then that becomes much more of a problem. And those gaps that those children have start to get bigger and bigger, and it reaches the point where they start to not even be able to meet the expected age levels. Another problem that you've got is pupil mobility. I know that at our school we've had a turnover of more than 40 children since the start of the year. You're not sure where they're coming from. You're not sure what they've got in their background. So it's really important that you consider that when you're thinking about planning your lessons. You need to constantly assess the children as you're doing your live marking, moving around the classroom, so that you know exactly where gaps might be falling. And then obviously we've got our disadvantaged children, or pupil premium. And we know that they probably come from a background that is not as rich in experiences as other children. And this can lead to further gaps. So it's all about trying to narrow some of those gaps. Okay, now one of the things that causes a very big gap in children's learning is the vocabulary gap. Lots of you probably already heard about this. So pupils, on average, when they leave high school, they need about 50,000 words as their vocabulary to be able to be successful in their education and then beyond that. And obviously that's a huge number of words. And if you consider that the average pupil only learns somewhere between 2,500 to 3,000 a year, they're going to need to have that vocabulary input from somewhere else. And most of that is going to come from home, but not all children have the same level of access to that, like a vocabulary rich environment. So you can see there that we have got some testing that was done to see if they can identify the difference that social standing has. What impact does it have on your actual level of vocabulary? And you can see over on the left hand side, we've got our professional families. The vocabulary that the parents have is much larger than those that's from the non-professional groupings, especially when you compare it to those children that are disadvantaged over on the left. And because the parents' vocabulary is not as wide, the children's vocabulary is not as wide either. And you can see towards the bottom of there the average different words used. The difference between someone from a good social background in that they have access to lots of vocabulary rich environments, to books, their parents read to them on a regular basis. They have a much higher number of words that they know compared to those children that don't. And of course that has a very, very big impact. And one of the important things to remember is that in maths, we can use STEM sentences. Now, those of you that haven't heard of STEM sentences, they are sentences that allow children to answer questions using some scaffolding, so that it sort of helps to embed and strengthen their learning and their understanding. And obviously children that have got a come back from a vocabulary rich background have already got lots of that in place, but those children that come from a vocabulary poor background, they really do need that that input from us to help them succeed. On average, you probably have 5 maths lessons a week. Each day, you're going to have slightly different STEM sentences. They're probably going to build on what the children have done the day before, and they may even use those STEM sentences that they used the day before as well. But you'll need to introduce the new ones, so they've got that constant access to vocabulary, and vocabulary that is used in the correct way. And it's one of the ways that will really help to boost a child's progress.
Just to add on to that one, I will send through some links when I send through the PowerPoint slide with some STEM sentence banks for you. It's one of those things that you probably do quite a lot of already, but chances are you probably use a very similar one for lots of your learning. We want our children to kind of be able to reason so well. So I'll give you an example. I was teaching a year 4 class, few weeks ago now, and we were looking at equivalent difference. So if you add 2 to the first number, add 2 to the second number, the difference remains the same, but it's much easier to solve. So the children were able to spot the pattern. Oh, you added 10 to the first number, Mrs. Phee, added 10 to the second number, the difference remains the same. So they're starting to generalize, to come up with a rule. And then I introduced the term of minuend and subtrahend. Minuend being the amount, you know, they've got to start with, and then the subtrahend, the amount they're taking away. All of a sudden, their reasoning up levels significantly, and they're able to say, well, if you add 5 to the minuend and add 5 to the subtrahend, the difference remains the same. And all of us, can you see that by using that type of vocabulary, they're able to then apply it to absolutely any problem that they've got. Well, I'm just going to add 5 here and 5 there. They were already saying first number and second number, but I've now added in that vocabulary and those key terms. And if you think about what we do for Key Stage 1, you know, early years Key Stage 1, we talk about digraphs, we talk about homophones quite quickly. So it's just that same idea. But I think for us as teachers, and when we're doing maths, it's about having that confidence, is it? And that kind of CPD behind. And we are going to send you some links where you can find lots of reading materials, so you can start to put this in. But I'm not just saying you do that for your higher intending children. You're going to do that for all of your children, because the expectation is they're looking at patterns and spotting things. So I am going to say, I'm going to say it, and then child A is going to say it, and then I'm going to get child B to say it, and then we're all going to say it as a class. So all of a sudden that child has heard that sentence or that phrase 4 times, and then they're going to do it in their work, and one person's going to say it and someone's going to repeat it, and we're all going to say it together. So all of a sudden they're building up that confidence, they're able to explain these words and see them in different contexts. So just to add on. Right, let's move forward.
Okay, so one of the important things that you can use to help you access the materials that you need so that all of those children can make the progress that they deserve to make is by visiting the NCETM's website. There's lots of fantastic resources on here, but the one that we want you to have a look at the moment is the prioritisation documents. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at the actual website itself, so that as I talk through bits of it, hopefully it will appear on the screen so that you know exactly what it is that we are referring to.
Hopefully you can see all that okay?
By magic, it has appeared. Hey. Okay, so the map that you can see sort of at the top of the page there, where you've got the autumn 1, autumn 2, spring 1, spring 2, etc. You've got the colour-coded map. On the previous page to this, there is a map of those for every single year group, and they're color coded so that you can see which subjects link with each other. Once you've decided which year group you're going to have a look at, you click on that year group, so in this case, year 3, and you'll see that we've got a list of the units covered and the suggested number of weeks that those should take. Now, prioritisation, the words, obviously, these are priority things that we need to teach. Now, everything that's on this site covers the entire maths curriculum, okay? It comes with full teacher guidance and teaching slides. Those slides are made for you to take them, adapt them, get them to work how you want. They are usually quite animated, and the slides that you get, also the start of them, come with lots of guidance about teaching points, how it links into prior learning, how it's going to link into the learning still to come. And you get a full choice of which resources you use. Now, it's not designed for you to just sort of put it up on the screen and just go. You will need to have a look at what is available, and in some cases you might adapt it, some cases you might add some things in, or you might actually take some things out. It's all designed to help you put together some good lessons designed to plug in some of those gaps that might have already existed. And there are also some links within the documents as well that link to documents from the DFE as well, and other exemplification materials. Okay, so I think...
Right, okay, So just to add on to that, so I don't know if you saw on the one of the slides as I was doing my very best kind of, here's one I made earlier example. Let's see. So here are your individual teaching points. So you might find, for example, that my children are struggling when they're adding 3 numbers together. So you know that you don't need to do teaching point 1 or 2, but actually maybe I want to have a look at the first then and now so that I can see what that looks like. So if you're using a scheme of work, remember, the big thing for me is always about using, not following. So you're going to use that scheme of work to make it work for your children. So they're always written with small steps of learning, but sometimes our children need an even smaller step. So you can go, for example, straight to where it has for point 3. As Adrian was just saying there with the examples of the teaching slides that go with it, I've got an example of what it looks like. It gives you a direct link to the page you need. So in order to understand the questions that go behind those PowerPoint slides, etc., you need to go to this document here, and that will then tell you the kind of the questions, what you should be looking for, and it will tell you, for example, read pages 8 and 9. Read pages 15 and 16. And the big thing to remember is that they're fantastic documents. A few years ago, these came out as spine materials and they were written as CPD. And then some people use them as a scheme of work, and they've been adapted now for these prioritisation materials so that you can dip in and read sections at a time as and when you need to. The animations, as we said, are all done for you, and you can cut and copy them as you need to in your classroom. The other thing that Adrian and I wanted to show you, and it's got to be the last thing that's on here, otherwise it won't work, is the not prioritisation materials, the ready to progress materials. They link in with the prioritisation materials, and the ready to progress documents came out in July 2020. And they were designed to kind of really unpick that these are the key things that your children need to know before they go into next year. They aren't everything, and obviously they've now built on that with the prioritisation documents. But what I wanted just to show you here was when we're looking at what do we need to know, what to do, where our children are struggling with. So this is number and place value, and this is, for example, where it sits in year 1, counting backwards and forwards within 100. So that's where you want to teach. But my children are struggling with this at the moment, so it then gives you the early learning materials and links so that you can then dip back into early years and then go back to where you're teaching. It then gives you where those children are going to move forward to, and that's the same for all areas. So let me just show you another example a bit further down. As it says here about the connections, it's got example questions there so that you can see where your children are at. It tells you some where it's got it highlighted here. There's some of your STEM sentences that you can be using. What you should be looking for to make sure that your children are confident and kind of ready to move on. Again, it's not everything, but it's just there for you to use, another supplementary resource that I think is really going to benefit your children. What I particularly like about those literally is that kind of, you've got that horizon. So I'm in year 4 and my children are struggling with this, right? I need to go back to year 3. And if they're still finding it difficult, you need to go back then to year 2. If we just keep going as teachers, and Selena and Katie, you'll know this, if you just keep going, you're always going to have those holes in the wall, aren't you? So when you come to later on, you're going to go and teach something and that big gap is missing. I've just taught a year 5, excuse me, cohort of children, and we are now looking at adding fractions with different denominators. Okay, I'm a bit of a fractions nerd, I love it. And I had to go back to year 3 because then there were some key areas there that they missed. That idea of adding like fractions, you know, fractions with the same denominator. 1/7 add 4/7, one lot of 1/7 and 4 lots of 1/7. What does that equal? So we can start to get those rules and routines in place, those STEM sentences. We then had to spend a few days on the year 4 materials looking at equivalent fractions, not the whole unit of work, which would have been about 2-3 weeks, but I looked at those kind of building blocks. What did they need in order to access year 5? And now I'm going back and I'm teaching year 5. So what would have been a 3-week block has probably taken nearer to 5 weeks, but actually those children needed those steps. And to go in and to hear children enjoying fractions being able to talk it in terms of wholes and parts confidently, talking about the different denominators. I need to make them the same. I'm going to multiply this by 4, etc. It really is worthwhile. So do take that time. And I know as teachers, that as RQTs, if you're just still early on in your teaching career, it's tough to get the time to do it. But actually, there's materials there to support you and to help you. So please do pick it and have a look. Okay, right. Let's go back. Let's go back on track to my little slideshow. So we will put the links in there for you for these documents, so you can access those. They are free to download. As I said, they were. It was published by the DfE in the summer term a couple of years ago now, and then obviously they brought out the prioritisation materials. But definitely worthwhile having a look at both. Okay. So why are we doing this? And the big thing for me is I'm always learning from other people, whether I'm learning from schools that I visit, from students that I'm teaching. And I was very lucky a couple of years ago now, pre-pandemic, to go to China and spend 2 weeks in Shanghai in 2 schools to find out what they do, why they do it so well. First of all, I'll tell you, they have big classes. I went into a couple of classes, 48 children, 1 teacher, no support staff in there, and they manage it so well. Did all children succeed? Yes, they did. Did they all move forward in their learning? Yes. It was finding out how they did that was my big thing. They do use a textbook scheme, but not how you would think. So they all have their textbook that every school in the district in Shanghai will use. Everyone has the same. But what the teachers do with it in their schools is slightly different. So they move through it at the same time. So you can go from school to school and they'll be working at the same area. So fractions in one school is fractions in another school. But they make it work for their children. And part of that is reading it ahead. Identifying what they call the difficulty points, and that for me is a massive piece of learning and a massive shift in how I plan my lessons now. So the difficulty points, what are my children in this lesson going to find difficult? Is it the vocabulary? Is it that they're going to mix up area and perimeter because we've just recently done area? Is it that they're not confident in their times tables and I'm going to have to provide something? But what is my class going to find difficult? And then they spent their time preparing their teaching around that difficulty point. So they did the textbook page, they answered the question, but in their way. But they spent their time really highlighting that difficulty point, exposing them to examples so that when the children came to do the questions and tasks themselves, they were able to do it because they spotted the challenges, they spotted the difficulties. What are my lower retainers going to find difficult in this lesson today? Well, they're going to find this section here. So I'm going to provide an additional scaffold. I'm going to give them some pre-teaching. I'm going to give them an opportunity later on for a bit of overlearning. I'm going to provide them with all of that exposure to that rich vocabulary, but then I'm going to spend a little bit of time with them. But I'm also going to encourage them to be independent, so to work with somebody else of a slightly different attainment so that they can collaborate on things. But the way that the teachers spent time on those difficulty points was something that for me transformed my teaching. So when you're looking at your white rose planning, when you're looking at MaST No Problem or deepening understanding, whatever it may be, other schemes are available as the line says. But whenever you're doing that, look at what's my child going to find difficult. It might give you an example in there, keep an eye out for, but actually you might have something different. So if the children have missed out year 2, bridging those 10s and that, addition and subtraction within 100, you might have to expose them to some of those key examples. You've said already that there's keep up opportunities. When is that going to happen? So if a child's not reading very well, we'll always give them opportunities to read outside of the reading lesson, outside of their writing lesson. They need those opportunities in MaST to do exactly the same thing. So if they are finding it difficult, a quick 5-10 minutes, whatever it may be, outside of that MaST lesson to have additional practice. Sometimes we go so quickly that they don't have the time to really have a go at it. So providing those opportunities, and we want a well-balanced curriculum. But we also need to remember that these children need some of these key skills going forward. And as Adrian said earlier, if they're missing those gaps, missing those elements in their learning, then they can't move on to the next day because they haven't really mastered and consolidated what they did the day before. So it's hard, it's tough, but if you can find a chance, even if it's a couple of times during the week, to give them additional practice, it is well worthwhile. We've already said about STEM sentences already, and I cannot tell you how valuable the importance of good quality vocabulary in your maths lessons is. So you've got to be modelling it, your support staff have to be modelling it, and your children need to be using it. If they want to give you a one-word answer, okay, give it to me in a sentence, you write it on the board, you've got it there written down so that they've got something to follow. But lots of our children now are doing the Mastering Number programme, and lots of that is about STEM sentences and children speaking every single day using mathematical language, and that's what you need to be doing. You'll know it already, but regular use of resources, getting your tens frames, getting your Numicon, getting your Deans out, even for those children who are at a greater depth, because for them to use those resources and explain to somebody else how to use them, sometimes it's quite hard for them, and it deepens their learning. Again, the resources that I've already mentioned, they all talk about the use of these materials in their lessons. So just consider, how often do you get them out? You need to make sure that it's part and part of your daily lesson. Have they got easy access to those resources, or do they have to go dig in a cupboard and say, excuse me, can I go get them? So just try and have access. There is a point, and I understand in year 2 and in year 6, where you've got those test times, and you need to say, okay, for these 2 questions, I don't want you to use resources. Absolutely, and that's the right thing to do, because they need to develop that independence without the resources. But you'll know that children will stop using them when they're ready. They'll know when they don't need to use those resources anymore. So provide access to them as often as you can. And the big thing here, and it says, I put here about, you're working for the needs of the majority, and then you provide that scaffold. So you teach to everybody, and then you provide that scaffold, that additional intervention, that pre-teaching beforehand, so that when they come into that lesson, those children are confident and able to access. And that's what we've seen in China. That's what I saw in Shanghai. It was quite an incredible thing to see all of those children making that amount of progress within such a short space of time. They all enjoy maths, they all want to do well in maths. They have regular communications with parents, so it's it's something that we can definitely all learn from. And if anyone wants to catch up with a cup of tea and to watch some videos at any point, you're more than welcome to do so. Right.
Okay, so we've talked about gaps in learning and how that can stop a child from progressing. Well, misconceptions do exactly the same thing. They're like a blockage in the learning. They are a stumbling block. They are going to stop a child from understanding a concept sufficiently to be able to make the progress required. Now, if you're lucky enough to follow something like White Rose or Power Maths, Maths No Problem, they all come with the planning already done for you. And a big section of that planning for every single lesson is all about possible misconceptions and ways of dealing with them. And that is because if a child gets a misconception that you don't correct, they're not going to be able to progress to the end of that lesson, and they're almost certainly going to struggle with new learning in the lessons that come next. Now, there's various different ways that you can overcome this. You can think about when you're planning, you can think about what those misconceptions might be and how you can teach to avoid them. Or you can actually use those misconceptions as teaching points. You can put them into your daily slides. So, for example, you might put 5 times 0 equals 5. And ask the children, oh, what's the problem there? Something's not quite right, and get them to discuss it. And being able to discuss it with their friends will help some of those children that are unsure about that to understand what the issue is. It's not always something that is easily solved. Sometimes you might need to, if you've gone around during a lesson and you've noticed that one particular child is getting something wrong, and you've had a quick look through and it's because they've misunderstood the concept, then if you've got time, you can correct that within the lesson. That's fantastic. You'll be able to then move straight on next lesson. But sometimes that's not always possible. And sometimes you may need to plan in an extra intervention in the afternoon, for example, for someone to go back over that material to identify exactly what the misconception is and then to correct it. The other things that we need to think about is deepening activities. Now, I have got absolutely lots and lots and lots of deepening activities. So if you want to email me, my email address will be on the end of the PowerPoint. I can email you any of the resources that I have got. One of my favourites is on the screen now. So that is the Enrich website, and there are lots and lots of activities there designed to deepen that understanding. And you'll find that your more able children, those children that sort of they zip through their work, they'll need some additional challenge if they are going to keep on making progress. And as you can see, Lisa's showing you lots of different activities that you could choose to help deepen that learning, and they're all readily made. They all come with instructions. They come with a sort of star challenge level guide so that you can sort of have a look at them and decide whether it's appropriate for that particular lesson. And it will often go through the key concepts that particular thing will do. You'll also get, as you can see there, the key questions you might want to ask the children, so they're often readily made for you. What you could do as extension tasks to those activities, and they really are engaging activities that really do sort of get those children talking about the maths, getting them to better understand what they can do. Another website that I use is one that is designed to, it's called Which One Doesn't Belong? Now, on that one, I don't know if, I think Lisa's going to have a quick look for it. That's it. So this one is an absolutely fantastic one to get the children talking. There's a great big list of resources that you can use. So for example, if we look at number, and the way it's designed is you have 4, in this case, numbers, but it could be objects, it could be shapes, it could be almost anything. And the idea is to get the children to talk about which one of those doesn't belong and why. And what they've done is they've been quite tricky about it. They've made sure that there's more than one option every time. For example, a right angle triangle, but none of the others are. And you can see over on the left hand side there, we've got various reasons why different shapes could be the odd one out. We've got a right angle triangle, well, none of the others are right angle triangles. We've got a hexagon, all the others are triangles. We've got 3 that are white shapes, 1 that has been shaded in grey. There's lots of different things that really get children talking and give them a chance to use that maths rich vocabulary. Which will really help develop their understanding. Now, on this website, the things aren't available on their range right from sort of year 1 all the way up to sort of year 9, year 10 in high school as well. So there's lots of different ones that you could go to. Another thing that you can use, I often, in my classroom, I often have sets of packs of cards because packs of cards are great for getting the children to talk about maths. So, for example, you might be using them for, again, you could do an odd one out with them. They could put 4 down and say which ones are the odd ones out. I often do fluency-based tasks with them. So you can, if you take out the picture cards, as they each throw a card down, say it's a 5 and a 6, well, 5 times 6, What's the answer to that? And the first person that shouts it out gets to keep the cards. And you'll be amazed how just a little bit of competition like that can really focus the children to improve their fluency. And by improving their fluency, their progress increases as well. So I've got lots of other ideas for those. So if you are interested in that, feel free to just email me, and I'll send over all the links that I have got for you, and I'm more than happy to share.
So the link will be on there that takes you straight to the Enrich. We've also added on here these deepening strips, because obviously Katie will be aware. I'm going to say Katie because I'm hoping Selena is too, or will be in the future. But we don't want to move our children on to something that's very, very different. So you might use an Enrich for one session when the children have finished looking at the objectives and making sure those objectives are the same. You might decide to give them one of these stickers or task strips at the end to get children to write about their maths. And it could be, for example, things like mistakes I could make and what they can do about them. So getting children to really identify what have I got to be careful about, and getting them to write that down. The answer can't be this because, you know, you're multiplying by a 10 and thinking about the digits and the place value and which way they're moving and so on. So again, it's just about providing opportunities to deepen that learning. Another one is about asking them to come up with a solution that's incorrect, and then explain how it's wrong and correct it. And that's really hard. If you think about it, it's like almost like if you're a fantastic singer and someone says to you, can you sing out of tune? It's really hard to kind of put your brain into that way of working. So getting them to think slightly differently. So Adrian's absolutely right. We've spoken a lot about progress for those children with gaps, but we also want to make sure that our children who are working towards greater depths in maths, we are continually pushing them whilst spinning that wonderful plate and making sure your children who are working towards are doing that at the same time as your children who are expected, so that everyone is making progress or better than good progress. So this is just something to consider going forward. So Katie, you're already here, but Selena, if you're looking forward to it in the future, the Maths Hubs, there's lots of information online to access. It is free. It's free for them, and you get to work with people like me again, which is great. So there are links on the webpage, and if you're locally based, so I'm not sure where you are, Selena, but if you're in Beds, Herts, Bucks, not Herts, Beds, Bucks, Oxfordshire way, you can come and join us at the Enigma Hub, where we can kind of work on some more of these things going forward. So it just leads us, we are 4:53, which I think for me is actually quite good today, Adrian. I think I'm quite happy. So teaching for mastery, hopefully you've got a bit of a better understanding. So yes, Selena, get in touch with me. I'd love to kind of support you in your school going forward. As I say, it's part of the government. We're funded by the government and so on going forward. So it's a national programme. I know that Adrian's spoken about the kind of gaps in learning, and it sounds silly, but why did we go over, what gaps we have? But it's really important to remember that actually what's happened historically, it isn't our fault as teachers. It's happened, but it is our responsibility now. And that's the tough bit. And I've been in challenging people progress meetings, and people said, but that's not my fault. This is where they came up to me. And absolutely, it isn't your fault, but now it's your responsibility. So what are we going to do as teachers to support these children and move them forward? Hopefully you've got a bit of a better understanding about the prioritisation documents and the Ready to Progress materials. I think the best thing for me is always about dipping in and exploring and having a go, and the more you add something in, the more familiar you'll become with them. So if you know you've got fractions coming up, spend your first time looking at the fractions, what can you add in, and then kind of put it away for a while, and then when you come to your next unit, because there's lots in there and it can be quite overwhelming, but I will tell you now, it's worthwhile having a look at, and it's free, which is also really good. Adrian's told you a bit about his school example, about the things that he does. And Adrian and I work in a very, very, very similar way. We've spoken a bit about the Shanghai experience again, and the impact that that's had, not just on me, but that impact now has been kind of going across the schools that I work with. Because for me, as I said to you, that identifying the difficulty point, you can say, what are my children going to find difficult? Don't just take the question out. What are you going to do to make that question accessible to all of your children? You'll find that more of them make progress going forward. And Adrian said already about the the misconceptions and what you can do. Again, it has to feedback in the moment in a timely manner. We're always talking about feedback and what does it look like in your skills. But if you genuinely are able to kind of do it in the moment, then the children will make even better progress, and that's what we want going forward. If you've got any questions, just tap them in. No worries. Well, the information will be in there. I'm glad that you both enjoyed it. Thank you. As I said, I look forward to kind of working with you across the coming months, and hopefully our paths will cross again. Information will go out so that if you want to get access with the hub, so Selena, getting your school involved would be great. Katie, I look forward to hopefully I'm meeting you at an embedding or a session going forward. Adrian, anything you want to add before we?
Yeah, just what I said before. I have got lots and lots of resources, and I'm always willing to share them. So if you want to email me, I can send you everything that I've got. More than happy to share. And just remember that all children deserve to make good progress, and we're the key to that. And the good thing is that all it really takes on our part is just a little bit of effort, a little bit of time, and a little bit of forward planning, and we can make every child successful.
Thank you. And lastly, just to say thank you for Chiltern for allowing us to come and take over the screens for the past hour. So